So today in this session, I'm going to be talking about opportunistic infections, how the opportunistic infections come about, how your immunity comes to be weakened, and examples of these opportunistic infections. Opportunistic infections, these are infections that are caused by microorganisms which usually do not cause harm to a healthy individual but can cause serious illness when your immune system is weakened. Now, that means they have no ability to cause infection unless if your immune system gets suppressed. So what really weakens your immune system in particular? So in this case, I want to let you know that this could be one of those conditions that could lower your immune system. One of them is HIV. HIV can lower your immune system down. How does HIV? Because I want you to understand the science behind which HIV can lower your immunity. Now, HIV can lower your immunity because once the HIV enters to your body, it will go into your body and, of course, join the bloodstream. Now, in the bloodstream, we have what we call the CD4 cell count, actually, the CD4 cells. So, these CD4 cells are responsible for patrolling your body. Whichever antigen or microorganism that they find, they tag. In other words, they mark that major antigen or that major microorganism, so that the body's defense can actually destroy that organism. Now, in the case that HIV has entered you, these CD4 cells will, of course, go and mark the HIV. The HIV will take that advantage of being marked by entering inside the CD4 cell count and commanding the CD4 cell DNA to produce more viruses. Now, as these more viruses are being produced, remember, this very HIV has got the ability to destroy those very CD4 cells. Of course, after the CD4 has produced more virions, in other words, the young ones of the virus, after it has produced more virions, these virions will reach to a stage where they will have to rupture in order to go and infect another CD4 cell count, another CD4 cell. So as they are rupturing this CD4 cell to move to the next CD4 cell, of course, they will lead to destruction of the primary CD4 cell. Now, as they move from one CD4 cell to the next one, they will, even the body itself, of course, as it has marked that here I am with a virus, the body itself will destroy those CD4 cells containing the virus. So as the body is destroyed and the virus itself is destroyed, it will lead to drop down of the CD4 cell count. And once the CD4 cell count drops down, your body will be vulnerable to getting infections. Now, what are the advantages of the CD4? One, I told you, they help in the marking of any other foreign bodies. In other words, once their number is destroyed and they fall down, you realize that any other infection that comes, they will be unable to mark all those other microorganisms for destruction. So some of the organisms will go unmarked and they will be going to destroy other body parts when the defense of the body has not detected. So they act as detectors, like security guards in your body. Then, of course, they also help in activation of protein, of antibody production. Of course, the antibodies are proteins, so they help in the activation of the process through which antibodies will be produced. Realize once there is need for production of antibodies, it is this CD4 cell that will communicate that we have got a certain foreign body here. So can you produce the soldiers against it? So now it will lead to production of what? Antibodies for your security. Then, of course, the presence of CD4 also activates macrophages, also called the CD8 killer cells. So they help in activation of the killer cells that will help in destruction of these microorganisms. Then, of course, these CD4 cells also help to coordinate the adaptive immunity and the innate immunity. In other words, the immunity that you have gotten through maybe drugs or something else, and the immunity that you have that you're born with. Remember, so that means it helps in the coordination of the adaptive immunity and the innate immunity that you are born with. That is one of the that is one of the causes of weakening of your immunity, allowing opportunistic infections to come into play. As I told you, that is HIV. The next one is cancer chemotherapy. Cancer chemotherapy, this one comes in, remember, this is use of chemicals in order to counter the effect of this, use of chemicals in order to stop the growth of these cancerous cells. Cancer is unprogrammed. In other words, unprogrammed growth of cells, unprogrammed cell division. So cells are growing, but nobody has programmed them. No cell-mediated programming is in place. So now once you take these cancer drugs, they will go and stop any other growth of any other cell. In other words, they counter any fast-growing cell. Now, remember, once your body has what they call the recycling system. Like, for example, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, actually the blood cell company. Realize that the blood cells, after a specific period of time, they will reach to a period where they will be destroyed because they have grown old and they will be need to replace new ones. Like, for example, the RBCs, the red blood cells, will take 120 days for them to be destroyed. Now, in this case, you realize that once they get destroyed, there will be need for the bone marrow, of course, the mother producer of blood cells. There will be need to produce more blood cells, and because there will be need for rapid cell division, these drugs will assume that is also cancerous, so they will stop the growth of these majorly these blood cells, leading to a lower quantification of the blood cells. Majorly, of course, the blood cells that are responsible for fighting of infection, which is the macrophages, the neutrophils, and of course the platelets. So all that process also leads to the lowering of your immunity. Then, of course, we can also talk about long-term use of corticosteroid drugs. Now, corticosteroid drugs include dexamethasone, prednisolone, beclomethasone. Then, of course, we can also talk about triamcinolone. We talk about dexamethasone. All those drugs in that class, once you take them for so long, they will be in position to predispose you into a lower immunity. How? Remember, these drugs are majorly prescribed in conditions like autoimmune diseases. Of course, we can also give them in terms of asthma. So once you take these drugs for a longer period of time, they always work by stopping the inflammatory response. Now, inflammation is a body's non-specific reaction towards the presence of pathogens or antigens in your body. Now that process has been stopped, once that process stops, you realize that your body will be liable to invasion of any other infection because the inflammatory responses are not coordinating to destroy these other organisms. So any organism can go in, and because the body has been silenced, do not react. So because they have been silenced not to react, so these other pathogens will gain access to thrive, grow, multiply, and finally invade and colonize your body, leading into infection. Of course, now your immunity gets down because these drugs will, of course, stop the inflammatory response, which is primary key factor in your body defense. Then, of course, we also talk about severe malnutrition. Severe malnutrition is one of those factors that can weaken your immunity. How does severe malnutrition help in the weakening of your immunity? Remember, your body requires proteins for body repair. Of course, even the production of antibodies, which are like the soldiers in your body, they also require proteins. Then, of course, we also know that most of this body functioning and normal physiology of the body is dependent on the nutrients that are going to be. So if there is poor nutrient delivery to different parts of the body, so the body will always have a low development. For example, we also know that we have what we call the barriers like the skin and other parts. So once you are malnourished, so the body will fail to develop those cells. For example, if you have maybe an injury on your skin and there is need for wound healing, but because you are malnourished, so there will be no enough proteins that will be required in order to bridge the gap of the wound that is there. So that also helps in weakening your immunity because your body is unable to produce antibodies and other things that are required for replacement of worn out tissues in your body. Of course, we also understand that diabetes also is one of those factors which has led to weakening of people's immunity. How does diabetes lead into weakened immunity? Now, remember, diabetes is prolonged glucose concentration in your blood. This is higher levels of glucose in your blood. Now, once there is higher levels of glucose in your blood, glucose is a chemical substance. Now, higher levels of chemical substance like glucose in your body will lead to destruction of the endothelium lining, that lining of the blood vessels inside. Remember, where the blood is passing is hollow. So the lining through which the blood flows, that lining through which the blood flows will get destroyed because of the chemical composition of this glucose. And once there is a chemical composition of glucose and destruction of this and destruction of this inside lining, that will lead into what we so-called the inflammation. So inflammation will come in because there is destruction. So the inflammatory response will come into play. It becomes a must for it to come into play in order to rescue that area. And once now there is rescuing of that area. The next thing that will happen is, now that there will be healing of those inflamed parts, leading into venous stenosis, which is a hardening of the blood vessels. And once there is hardening of the blood vessels, the healing process will come into play. And once the healing process of those inflamed parts or those injured parts comes into play, of course, there will be narrowing of the blood vessel. And once there is narrowing of the blood vessel, now, moment your blood vessels become narrow, there will be poor supply of blood and nutrients to different other parts. That's why you realize once your blood vessels get narrowed due to high glucose concentration, someone will have blindness, because the blood vessels supplying the eye will have issues. So you will have retinopathy coming into play. These people will always complain of peripheral neuropathy, which is pain on the lower sides of their bodies, which can be like the arms and of course maybe also the legs. Why? Still because the blood vessels supplying that area have become narrow. Now there is low supply of nutrients to those particular parts of your body. Now the body is fearing to necrotize. In other words, the cells are fearing to die. So there will always be that nippy pain that will be coming. So that people will feel like, I have burning sensations on my feet, I have burning sensations on my arms, and all that. These other lower parts here, it is because the blood vessels supplying that major part in particular have been narrowed. Not only that, once there is these things keep happening, there's what they call formation of advanced glaciation end products, with the so-called agents. So once there is high concentration of glucose in your blood vessel, what happens is this glucose will get attached to other products that are present along the blood vessel. One of them is hemoglobin, leading into HbA1c. Actually, that is a glaciated hemoglobin. Then, of course, we also realize that this will lead into formation of other. For example, the proteins that are present along your blood vessel will also be glaciated. In other words, glucose will get attached to it. Then, of course, even the fats that are present along your blood vessel, once those fats are there, so they will also be glaciated. In other words, glucose will get attached to them. Proteins will also be attached to the glucose. The hemoglobin will also be attached to the glucose. So all those things will come into play. And once the fats and the proteins get attached to glucose, once there is attachment of fats and the proteins into glucose, they will always lead to the thickening of the endothelium lining, that lining through which the blood is flowing through. So once that lining gets thickened, of course, now the thickening of the blood vessels also comes into play. So that will hinder the movement of molecules across that membrane, that endothelium lining. So it will lead to concentration of all the other molecules in between the blood vessel. There will be no other movement of those other components that are present inside the blood vessel to the nearest tissue where there is an injury. So it will now hamper the movement of 1, the antibodies, 2, the neutrophils, 3, the macrophages into that site where there is an injury, also leading to lowering of immunity. So in other words, your body defense is unable to act and take part in case of any injury because the blood vessels have become stenosized, they have become hard, so there will be no other cross movement of the defense mechanism to go and aid in the rescue mission that has to be done. Then of course, we also realize that due to that very hardening, there will of course be what they call hypoperfusion. So that means low blood or oxygen supply into different parts of your body. And once there is low blood supply into different parts of your body, of course now the body will start complaining and all that, so leading into what they call atrophy. Atrophy is reduction in cell size. So in other words, most of these organs, they would require nutrients, they would require food, they would require glucose and other things. Now because there is little or no supply, they will have to reduce in size, leading into atrophy. So atrophy is a reduction of organ size. Now if the organ has to do like 500 functions, now the cell size has reduced. That means even the level of functionality of these organs will have to drop. If you've been doing 500, you'll have to cut down the budget to maybe start doing 300 or 200 of your effectivity that you are required to do. And in so doing, the body's immunity, of course, will be lowered down. Then, of course, we also understand that they will do what they call atherosclerosis, which is resulting from the build-up. Once there is corrosion or injury along your blood vessel, there will be it will provide loopholes for the build-up of these fats. And once there is build-up of these fats, they will start forming hips inside your blood vessel, of course leading into the narrowing of the blood vessel, a condition called sclerosis. Of course, when that happens, you realize that your immunity can easily go down. So examples of these infections which will come once your immunity goes down, of course, include tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is more related to HIV. And of course, you also realize there's what they call Mycobacterium avium complex. Also, you can call it MAC. Mycobacterium avium complex will be one of them. Then, of course, cryptococcal meningitis resulting from Cryptococcus pneumoniae. Then, of course, we can also talk about some parasitic infections like toxoplasmosis, really resulting from Toxoplasma gondii. Then, of course, we also have some viral infections like herpes simplex, cytomegalovirus. Then, of course, some fungal infections also can be coupled up like candidiasis, pneumocystis carinii. Then, of course, actually, pneumocystis girivari or girivechi. I don't know how you can pronounce it. Depends on the school you come from. Then, of course, we also talk about histoplasmosis. All those could be the infections that could surface once your immune system falls down. So this information is actually for medical advice, medical guidance. So once you see you're always having excessive diarrhea and all these other things, remember these infections, some of them like these are C. parva, then of course C. cayetanensis, all of them will lead to excessive diarrhea. That's why if someone has got HIV or that has gone into the 3rd clinical stage and going to the 4th clinical stage, these people will always have consistent diarrhea and all those things persistently happening because your immune system has gone down. So I will advise you, once you find any other deviation, this is majorly for consultation issues. Thank you so much. I will always be there to deliver to you the information. Andrew, Global Health Science Series. Thank you so much.